You're listening to Soundside. I'm supervising producer Sarah Leibovitz, and Soundside is on summer break this week. But have no fear, we still have plenty of show for you. We're spending this week sharing some of our favorite recent stories that you may have missed. And today, it's my turn. Now, I didn't just want to bring you my favorite book interviews or an interesting deep dive into the history of some obscure Washington thing you don't know about. I wanted to bring you stories that make you go, hang on a minute, what? Later this hour, we'll meet a local foosball champion and hear how her career has led to fame, fortune, and love.
So we ended up teaming up and we won that tournament. And that was pretty much the last time we played together. He became my husband.
But first, a curious phenomena known as the Oakville Blobs appears to have returned this year to a small southwest Washington community, 31 years after the first reports of an unidentified gelatinous substance falling from the sky. This time the goo fell on Rochester, Washington, near Gig Harbor. This story was first reported by Soundside back in May, and we're bringing it back to you now. And I need you to know, Soundside host Libby Dankman got really, really into this. It all started with a phone call to Allie McCrite, a 20-year-old from Rochester.
How did you first encounter the blobs?
So I had just gotten home from work and it was like pretty rainy out. And my girlfriend's mom was like, hey, like come look outside. There's some weird blobs. And I was like, so I used to live in Oakville. So like obviously I knew about the Oakville blobs because everybody does.
Well, not everybody does. After all, we're talking about something that happened 31 years ago. But for people who do know about it, this is the stuff of Washington legend. It even made it into an episode of Unsolved Mysteries back in the day.
Tonight on Unsolved Mysteries.
It rained down from the heavens like a plague. Tiny toxic blobs of goo that brought an outbreak of flu-like illnesses to Oakville, Washington, and left behind a perplexing mystery that may never be solved.
And yes, decades later, less than 10 miles away from Oakville, including right outside of Allie's house, it happened again.
And so what were the blobs like?
They're clear and like gelatinous. They're about the size of like the palm of your hand.
Oh, wow. So like bigger than what you hear about from the Oakville blobs 31 years ago. Like those ones were supposed to be small, but the ones you saw were pretty big.
I mean, I do have small hands, but yes.
Wow. And sorry, did you say that there was a smell or this
No,
is a
they
weird
didn't
question,
have
but
an odor at all. It was very just interesting. Like it just kind of smelled like rainwater, I guess.
and I mean, yeah, so knowing Oakville history, you were like, it's happening again.
Yeah, no, exactly. I was like, oh my God, like this is crazy.
Back in 1994, there were dozens of reports out there about the mystery of the Oakville blobs. But it may have never made news without Tom Paulson, a former reporter who broke the story. And to be honest, he really didn't think much of the blobs at first.
Well, I started out thinking this was going to be kind of a joke, and it was a slow summer day, and I was working as both assignment editor and journalist, a reporter, and I assigned myself the story. This woman called up from Oakville and told me the brief story. She said blobs fell out of the sky and her mom got sick and a kitten died, and I just was looking for some way to get out of the office. And so we drove down, the photographer and I drove down to Oakville.
What paper were you working for at the time?
I was with the Seattle Post-Intelligencer back when it actually was a paper.
Absolutely.
A photographer and I drove down, and we just thought this was a way to get out of the office. We didn't think this was going to be anything. And because there's, as we know, many conspiracy theories out there and a lot of goofy things that happen. And we went and met with Dottie Hearn and Sonny Barcliff, the mother and daughter. Sonny was the daughter. They told us this dramatic story about how these blobs fell out of the sky and they got sick, the kitten died. And I'm like, yeah. And I'm writing it down thinking I'm just going to have a fun, goofy story here. And then it started raining while we were there and blobs fell out of the sky. I mean, if you watch some of the TV shows afterwards, they make it sound like huge blobs the size of watermelons fell out of the sky. These were little tiny, clear gelatinous blobs about this half the size of a grain of rice. And so I collected some, and just took it with me, and I'm like, well, that's weird. And I have a background in chemistry. I was a science and medical reporter for the PI, so I was going to try and get these things tested. I went back and I wrote a joke story. I thought it was kind of a joke, but it was presented as a serious report, and it did happen. I mean, I saw the blobs. I thought, well, maybe it was airplane waste. They're not supposed to eject waste from their toilets in flight, but who knows?
But you were
There's
still
also,
brushing it off at that point, Tom, even though you saw it in person?
yeah, I mean, they had a cornfield next to their home, and I thought it was maybe just cornstarch when it gets moist and it rains, cornstarch coming out. And I just thought it was nothing. But I thought I'm going to play this out. I took a trip. So we wrote the story. I called the FAA, tried to find out if there was any chance this was a toilet eject from a commercial airline. They said no, it would be colored blue because it's got antifreeze or dye in it. So clear, no, not us. There's also a practice bombing run for McCord Air Force Base. They flew right over all the time and dropped bombs out in the ocean. So I called McCord Air Force Base. They thought it was kind of funny. They played along and said no, they didn't drop anything on anybody. And I talked to the police chief down in Oakville. He saw him, and he didn't act at first like it was a big deal. Although if you look at Unsolved Mysteries and some of the TV shows later, the police are getting covered in goo and very
It
dramatic.
was a
And
torrent of goo, yeah. So all these
so
people you're calling up, the local possibilities, your best guesses of where the blobs could have come from, you're coming up with nothing at that point. I mean, where do you turn next?
well, and she had fallen ill, and the physician at the hospital down there, he had tested him because they brought him in saying, we think this made Dottie sick. He found evidence of white blood cells, but said he didn't think it was anything serious. That's why he thought it was airplane sewage waste. Then, because Dottie and Sonny didn't think he took it that seriously, they wanted to sample, sent somewhere else to test. Department of Ecology tested and said, no, it's not anything living. It looks like it's inorganic. Then it went to the Department of Health. A microbiologist took it seriously and did test for it, and he said he thought it was animal cells of some kind and had some bacteria, common bacteria, but it was contaminated with bacteria. Anyway, so
Wait, so
people
you have
were,
conflicting reports then from different people testing this, saying it's inorganic and then saying it's organic?
yeah. So the testing resolved nothing. And then if you watch TV shows, I don't remember this, but they said men who looked military came into town secretly, and all the samples disappeared from the hospital and from the Department of Health. And, I don't know about that. I missed that part of the story, but it got to be this cover up. And there are a lot of different theories in town. One was that it was a military biological warfare experiment. One was that the bombs blew up jellyfish and the jellyfish pieces fell back in town,
Oh, the
which had,
test bombs that were being dropped ended up blowing up a large jellyfish and dropping all over people's
well,
houses?
or many jellyfish.
Uh-huh, okay.
Yeah. I forget what some of the other theories were, but one of the serious offshoots, and you never know what's going to happen with stories. Again, I started out thinking this was kind of a joke, but it was something to do. And like I said, a lot of the officials were taking it seriously, and some were just playing along. But it turned out when I wrote the first story and talked about the bombing runs going over there, that the military was not supposed to be dropping live bombs in that part of the ocean. It's a marine sanctuary. So two Congress people read my story, which again, it was like blobs fall from the sky, kitten dies. It's kind of a goofy
It was
story.
supposed to be a bit of a lark, yeah.
Jolene Unsold, who was one of the Congress people down there, and Norm Dix, I think, went nuts and called me up to find out what McCord had told me, because they said this was a violation of the Marine Sanctuary and that they were not supposed to be dropping bombs. So that became a whole other story. And so it turned into a real controversy.
So you
And
just
then
never
I just,
know when you're a young reporter or an assignment editor and something comes across your desk. what could come of it. And maybe getting out there
Yeah,
creates ripple effects. Yeah.
it spawned some real news. Anyway, eventually, because it just kind of kept spinning out of control and getting bigger and weirder and more conspiratorial, I remembered I had blobs myself in the refrigerator. So I wanted to take him to an independent lab, and the PI was willing to spend up to $100 on the test. They just, didn't want to spend a lot on it. So I sent it to a private lab, and they said they could do a basic test for that amount of money. But what they came back with was that it was polyacrylamide, which is this stuff in potting soil that soaks up water, those little blobs if you do gardening. They're in the potting soil or in babies' diapers. It's a material that's made to soak up water.
Oh, that gel stuff that soaks up water, that
Right.
keeps things dry.
That's what their guess was. And of course, nobody really wanted to accept that. That's a boring answer, I guess. They wanted biological warfare or jellyfish or whatever. But
But why would that stuff be falling from the sky, Tom?
well, we don't know.
Well, so at one point did you realize that this was getting like national attention?
Right away, actually. I mean, it went nuts right away. I mean, it is a legitimate mystery. It's still, and I guess the BBC had a story on it a while ago, and they said it happened somewhere in England, similar thing.
The blobs have fallen elsewhere.
Yeah, there's something called astral jelly that they think comes out of meteors. Anyway,
What?
yeah, astral jelly. But at any rate, yeah, I don't know what it is, but yeah,
So
it's just kept going and going. I've never, as a journalist, I talked to Nobel Prize winning scientists. I talked to several presidents, talked to Bill and Melinda Gates, went to Africa and Asia, did all these really important stories. And the Blobs of Oakville are probably the most long-lived, most re-reported story of mine. So that's my legacy is the Blobs of Oakville.
And that's the reason we called you up today, and that we were really excited to get to talk with you because you've actually been in the presence of these blobs. Can I just focus back on the conversations that you had with folks about their health effects? I mean, you heard that the Unsolved Mysteries folks reported that several people fell ill, that there were pets and small animals that died. Did you ever get a sense of the scope of how serious the health effects were?
Well, my experience reporting on it, a couple people fell ill. Dottie fell ill. The kitten did die. I guess there were other dead animals, small animals. One of the TV shows shows a dead cow. I never saw a dead cow. And well, later on, I learned they claimed that they were sickened. I didn't hear about it at the time. But from my perspective, it still could have all been coincidental, the amount of sickness and animal deaths. I didn't see any big swell of illness around this. And I didn't get sick. I picked it up with my hands and stuffed it in a baggie.
So what did you think when you heard that there was a potential new case of blobs falling from the sky near Oakville?
Well, I guess I'm not surprised. I mean, I think it's, like I said, I think it's happened. The story seems to come back of its own every couple years. And then like I said, I'll read up on it. And then other people report seeing this. There was a report of this in Wisconsin. So I think it's something. It's something atmospheric. Whether or not it's a health hazard or not, I don't know. It's a mystery.
It's a mystery. Do you think it will ever be solved?
Well, I think, yeah, if somebody really wants to solve it, I mean, I think, I think people like mysteries better than they like solutions.
Can I ask you a final question? This came to mind when you were wondering what the gel blobby goo was falling from the sky. Did you ever try tasting it?
Yeah, no, I wouldn't have done that. I had one minor theory that it was maybe the military planes probably don't have to dye their sewage blue, so maybe it was military toilet water. Knowing it could have had some kind of bacteria or human cells in it, I never thought of tasting it, I have to admit.
That's fair. Now that I know you suspected the sewage, I suppose that makes sense. Well, the Blob story lives on, and you will always be remembered. I'm sure for your other really important stories, but but mostly for the
but
Blobs.
mostly for the Blobs, yeah.
Any final thoughts before we go, Tom, on this whole thing and the fact that it's come back up again, that we're seeing the Blobs falling once more?
Well, I wish somebody would solve it. That'd be great. It can't be that hard. Get somebody out there.
What do you
don't
think
know,
they
yeah.
are?
I really don't know. I'm guessing it's just some sort of weird weather phenomenon, just because, like, they didn't seem chemically or anything. They were just kind of, like, watery, and, like, they melted after a while, but they weren't ice. Like, it was very gelatinous. We touched them with gloves because we heard, like, you could get sick from them before, and we did not want to get sick. So they were just really, like, it felt like you were holding Jell-O, but they were, like, kind of, like, a little dirty. I don't know.
Wow. Okay, so you touch them with gloves, you put them in a jar, and there were other people that saw them. Um, do you still have the jar with the liquid?
We do. I'm not sure where it is. I think it might be in our garage. I'll have to look for it.
Okay, so then how did your girlfriend or like anybody else react when you were looking at them? Like, did they know about the blobs the way you did?
Kind of like she didn't really know a whole lot, but I kind of like explained it a little. Not really, but I was just kind of like, oh yeah, like I'm from Oakville. Here's what they are, I guess. But I think she was like, she's really into science, so I think she thought it was like super cool, and like she loves like BuzzFeed Unsolved, and she's like, oh my God, like I heard about this on BuzzFeed.
Okay, so the theories that I talked to the reporter who 31 years ago first did the story on this, and his name's Tom Paulson. He worked for the Seattle PI, which is not even a paper anymore. And he said there were a handful of theories that he bought, and one was that it was some kind of like sewage absorbing chemical that dropped from some flights from McCord Air Force Base, Lewis
Yes.
McCord. The other one was that it was a gel that's a liquid absorbing gel that's found in diapers.
Interesting.
Yeah, and he said, I don't know why it would be falling from the sky. I don't know.
Yeah.
What do you think about what do you think about those ideas?
So I've heard the airplane one before. They did not smell at all. Like it was like just like it smelled like clean rainwater. I genuinely think it was more of like either an ocean thing or a weather thing because they didn't smell and like they weren't super like gross. Like they were just like how rainwater is like clean but still a little dirty?
Yeah.
It was kind of like that.
Wow. Okay, so I was on the phone with my dad earlier, and his theory was that in some places it can like really randomly, because of a weather event, rain fish. And so his theory was that it was like some kind of similar thing.
You're listening to Soundside. That story first aired in May of this year. But we'd still love to hear your theories. What do you think the Oakville Blobs are made out of? Send us your best guesses by emailing soundside@kuow.org or leave us a voicemail by calling 206-221-3213. That's 206-221-3213. We promise not to pick up. When we come back, how one Spokane woman has found fame, fortune, and love in a sport most people think of as a back-of-the-bar pastime. Foosball world champion Lotus Leong Chesbro joins us in just a minute, right here on KUOW. Stick with us. You're listening to Soundside. I'm producer Sarah Leibovitz. Now, let's talk foosball. The tabletop game with the little soccer guys. Maybe you're a hot shot at your local bar. You have a few tricks up your sleeve, and maybe they've even won you a couple of beers over the year. But we warn you, you are in an entirely different league from Spokane resident Lotus Leong Chesbro. She has won real money playing foosball. She's been coy on saying how much, but it's at least in the six figures. She's also claimed 2 foosball world titles and, in 2018, was inducted into the Table Soccer Hall of Fame. And last month, she brought home 2 bronze medals while competing in the Foosball World Cup in Spain. KUOW's Gabriel Spitzer sat down with Leon Chesbro before the World Cup in June to hear more about how she became a foosball legend.
Well, first off, I wonder if you could just give us the vibe at like a typical tournament, maybe like the one that you competed in recently.
It was the World Series, so we did have people come from other countries. You go into this tournament room, it's filled with tables. You walk in and you just feel like an instant high. Like, I got to play foosball. I got to see if I can win this tournament.
That sounds amazing. And I imagine you must catch up with a lot of people you've known for a long time. There must be a big social aspect to it.
Exactly. You know everybody if you've played for a long time. Everybody goes to the tournaments. You just try to beat your friends.
You have been at this for quite a while. You started when you were like a preteen, right? Tell us a little bit about how you got into it and what was it about foosball that hooked you? And why not darts or pool or something else?
Well, my brother had purchased a foosball table when I was 12, and it was just him and I, and he'd make me play him all the time. And then as the years went by, we started going to arcades as we're old enough to ride our bike there. And they had an arcade in Hilliard in Spokane called Bumpers. And we started going and playing there. And the owner there, Steve Livingston, had tournaments there. And I guess he actually noticed my talent and had sponsored me to a tournament in Vancouver and in Seattle. And there is where I got hooked. I did well in a tournament and it was like, okay, I can do this.
I love thinking of like the eagle-eyed arcade owner scouting talent at the foosball table and then boosting you into this world-class career now that you've had.
Yes, he was awesome. In fact, I still keep in touch with him.
And so, am I correct that foosball and this particular arcade were actually instrumental in making a love connection? Is that right?
Yeah, it's bizarre how it worked out. He actually had a $5,000 tournament years ago, and I didn't have a partner for mix. And here's this guy that drives up in this beat up Corvette, and he parked it in this field. And I'm going, who would do that? So as the day went, I was looking for a partner for mixed doubles, and this guy, Larry Chesbro, needed a mixed partner. So we ended up teaming up and we won that tournament. And that was pretty much the last time we played together. He became my husband.
So you have a foosball meet cute.
Yeah.
But you were on the same side for that tournament and that
Yes.
one only. Why is that?
It's tough. We're really competitive. So we'll do practices and it don't last long because I'll get annoyed. I'll stomp out of the game room, turning the light off.
Is
I'm done.
Because he plays dirty, I assume.
Yeah, he does. But after I met him, I dropped out of college and went touring with him. And my mom was going, "What the heck are you doing, girl?"
So touring was a really big part of your life for a while, but then you stopped. How did you wind up getting back into competitive foosball?
So, yeah, we toured for years. We got married, and then I had Sarah, my daughter, and I quit playing for, a long time. And then I just started playing again. So last year, no, it's been 2 years, they had a qualifying for the World Cup. The World Cup's like every 3 years. So you qualify if you win certain tournaments. So I had qualified a couple years ago, and here it comes.
So is this sort of the crest of your competitive wave since you came back into the sport or the game or however you refer to it?
Yes. Qualifying is the highest thing to do right now, right? To qualify for the World Cup. The first was winning a world championship. And then the next highest would be getting into the Hall of Fame. And that and the World Cup are the toughest.
So what's it been like to sort of take this ride again now on the other end of having had kids and taken a break and being in a different age bracket?
So much fun. It's so much fun. And it's all the good people that we played back when I was younger are now in the senior age group, right? So we just get older and they just make categories for us, right?
Yeah.
So now it was 50 and now it's 63 and the next one is 70, I guess.
It seems like one of the reasons that pickleball has had such a moment is that it's kind of touted as this thing that you can still do as you get older. You don't have to be in tip-top athletic shape. Do you think that foosball has some of that going for it as well?
Well, no, you have to be in shape
Uh-huh. Damn.
because the tournaments, they can start like at 9 o'clock and end at 2 in the morning. You can be called up at any time to play. You don't know. So you're there the whole time in the game room, kind of waiting for your match to come up. So you have to be ready. I actually play better when I'm tired
Hmm.
because I put that extra oomph in it. You know you're tired and it's like, okay, you got to try harder.
I did want to ask you about another Spokanean who will be joining you at the World Championships. I don't know how well you know each other, Sherry Davis, but she credits you as the inspiration to break into elite foosball in her 60s. Are you friends?
Yes, we are friends.
What's that been like to watch her meteoric rise?
She's doing great. She's been playing the last, I don't even know, 3 years maybe it was. She saw my interview in 2018 on TV and she got inspired and she's been playing and playing. She's moving up the ladder. So you start at amateur and then expert to pro to master. I think she's now an expert.
And you've been a master for many years.
Yeah, I've been one for a while.
Well, speaking as a rank amateur, maybe a sub-amateur foosball player myself,
Yeah.
I'm a little starstruck getting a chance to talk to you, and I wanted a piece of advice, etiquette advice. If you're playing at a bar, say, or dorm room, and your opponent commits a faux pas, such as rolling the rod like it's a rolling pin,
Spinning.
What do you call it?
Spinning the rod.
Yeah, spinning the rod. So
Yes.
What do you do? How do you handle it?
We try to explain to them that there's no spinning. But, if they want to spin, that's fine. We'll still beat them.
Yeah, I was gonna say, it's not going to help them if they're playing you.
Yeah, no.
We've been talking with Lois Leong Chesbro of Spokane. She is a foosball living legend who's going to be headed to Spain for the World Cup of Foosball, representing the United States of America. So, Lotus, thank you so much. Good luck on behalf of all Americans, and thanks for coming on Soundside.
Thanks.
And that conversation first aired in June of this year. Since then, Lotus has returned from the Foosball World Cup, where she won 2 bronze medals for the U.S. You're listening to Soundside on KUOW. When we come back, one Washington scientist's work to create a new kind of food for bees. How this food could help save the bees in just a minute, right here on KUOW. You're listening to Soundside. I'm Sarah Leibovitz. When you buy a fruit, a vegetable, a carton of almond milk, you might assume it's an animal-free product. But all of those foods, and many more, rely on one small but mighty member of the animal kingdom, the bee. Bees, especially honeybees, are an important part of any working farm. They pollinate everything from papayas to cucumbers to coffee beans. Like cows, pigs, or chickens, these little buzzy workers are considered livestock, cared for and managed by farmers and beekeepers so that you can have food on your plate. But unlike other livestock, there is one thing farmers haven't been able to do for their bees: provide nutritious, human-made feed when flowers aren't blooming. Until now. In May, scientists unveiled a new food source designed for livestock bee colonies. They say it could help bee survival rates across the world. KUOW's Gabriel Spitzer sat down with Brandon Hopkins to learn more about this food back in June. Hopkins is the P.F. Thurber Endowed Distinguished Professor of Pollinator Ecology at Washington State University, say that 2 times fast, and ran the trials for this new food. He also co-authored a study on the food source. Let's listen in.
So what do honeybees eat? Like, don't they eat honey?
Yeah, they do eat honey, but they eat honey in the winter times or times of dearth. So the honey that they consume and that people know very well and love comes from the nectar of the flowers that they visit. And that provides the sugars, the carbohydrates that they require and that they store for these long periods when there aren't flowers available. But a big part of their nutritional needs comes from the pollen of flowers, and that's all their protein and amino acids and vitamins and lipids and sterols and all these like essential components that they need to raise the next generation of bees. So to feed all the young larvae that are in the colony and that keep the colony going for months or years on end.
If bee colonies depend on pollen, why would their food be scarce? Like if these are bees that are on a farm helping to pollinate crops, why wouldn't those crops provide the nutrition that the bees need?
That's a great question. And it's one of the most complex issues, I think, in beekeeping and is often cited as like one of the biggest causes of sort of colony losses here in the U.S. and in other places around the world. It's great to imagine, and in some cases there are these, beautiful farms that have a diversity of floral resources or these beautiful open pastures, but those are more and more rare on the landscape these days. And so really modern farms and the vast majority of the landscape we have are either not suitable really for bees at all during a majority of the season, or just don't provide either just the sheer number of flowers or a good enough diversity of flowers in the landscape for the number of colonies that we have here.
I see. So these monoculture farms where you have like maybe a field of blueberries and then the bees are out pollinating the blueberries, but that's not a balanced diet for them.
Yeah, exactly. And honeybees have evolved to be generalists, and so they really require a diversity in the diet. So there's no real floral source that has all of the nutritional needs that bees require, and so they really need a diverse floral diet to be healthy.
But you have helped to create a new food source that seeks to be a comprehensive package of nutrition for these little guys. Can you tell us what this food actually is? Like, what does it look like? I mean, are there little buckets of pollen that you're putting in the hives?
Yeah, that's great. It's been a wonderful partnership with Apex Biosciences, who had spent years or decades, along with other researchers at other universities, kind of developing the science behind this diet to make sort of a truly complete replacement for pollen in the landscape. And what this looks like is, and I've now learned from my younger students here in the lab that this analogy was a little bit lost on them, but when I was growing up, we had these power bars that you would eat, before or after maybe a sporting event or something like that to get your energy up. And so, these types of protein bars that we eat as humans that are sort of soft protein or energy packed, squishy food type bars, it's a little bit like that. I can't think of another necessarily analogy, but it's a soft, slightly sweet, protein rich patty that goes in the hive.
Have you tasted them?
I have tasted them, yes.
How would you describe the taste?
Yeah, I would describe it as like a power bar, but would not, I don't think, do very well on the human market. So, it's slightly sweet. But other than that, it's sort of, bready, maybe sort of yeasty flavored. Not something not my go-to snack in the middle of the day, but, it's edible.
It doesn't taste floral?
It does not taste floral at all. That would make it better, I would think.
All right. So when you get one of these power bars, one of these like bee wafer things, and you pop it into the hive, can you explain like what happens next? How does the nutrition get to where it needs to go?
That's a great question. And so we just kind of put it in there, and the adult bees, and this is generally sort of this idea that bees, as they age, progress into different jobs throughout the colony that they need to perform to be successful. And so what we think is that in general, you have these nurse bees that would normally be going and eating stored pollen in the colony, to then use that nutrition to activate and stimulate the glands in the head of the bee to produce the secretions that then go to feed the larva. So those nurse bees then come and consume this pollen replacement diet that we provide in the colony. So they consume that and then convert those nutrients into some people call it bee bread or the royal jelly glandular secretions.
Bee bread. So, and that's something that these nurse bees are making inside their bodies with the fuel of the pollen.
The bee bread is what's often referred to as the stored pollen inside the comb. And so that's what they consume, and they convert it into royal jelly or the larval diet.
And so your wafer is kind of standing in for the bee bread a little bit.
Exactly, yeah. So it's a replacement for the bee bread, which, like we talked about earlier, is often in short supply, or it can sometimes be completely absent during the pollination of certain crops or at certain times a year, or in these harsher environments where there's a limited amount of pollen in the landscape, to the point where they consume everything they bring in immediately and never really get a chance to even store much in the way of pollen. And that can cause lots of downstream issues with the health of the colonies.
So why was it a hard problem to sort of figure out what the bees need to eat and what to put in the power bar?
That's a great question. It's because it's amazingly complex. And I think in some of these other livestock species, I think there's a bit more money or power sort of in those industries to support the research that's gone in to provide people and farmers with fully nutritionally complete diet. Even our dogs and cats, have this pelletized food that we feed them, and they can live their whole life and multiple generations as healthy animals. In honeybees, it's just taken us longer. I mean, it's a smaller industry, and so it's taken longer to develop this. And in some ways, I don't know if it's more complex, but it's a highly complex system, because you're not, like I said before, you're really feeding an adult bee a diet, and then they're converting that into a separate substance that's then feeding the larva. And so it's sort of highly complex to make sure that you're moving these micronutrients from the adult who's consuming the diet into the larvae that consume a separate substance.
So what is in these things?
Yeah, and so that's the stuff where, you get to patented diet IP protection type stuff. So the truth is I don't fully know. One of the interesting things is from the publication that we had, that we just published recently, is that while some of these things like the sterols make up, a 0.2% of the overall components of, say, the pollen replacement diet, they're critical for these colonies to be able to produce new generations of bees. So without this very small micronutrient, the larvae fail to develop and become adult bees.
Oh, wow. So you have to figure out which of these little organic compounds and stuff like that matter and which ones are less important.
Right. And in this case, it often takes, again, sort of the complexity of this is that you can't just feed an adult and know whether or not that was an essential thing. You have to have multiple generations, because if that micronutrient is missing in the diet, you don't know until, maybe 3-4 generations are raised on nothing but that diet before that micronutrient pops out as a problem and starts causing issues in development.
So we've talked about some of these colonies, crashing if they don't have enough nutrition. And this has obviously been a major issue across the country, across the world. We've been seeing, Save the Bees stickers and stamps and so on for years. So how are the bees doing? Do the bees still need saving?
They still need a lot of help. Bees in general need saving and need help. And so one thing that's important to differentiate is that, we've been talking about honeybees, and they are, absolutely critical to agriculture, and they're an amazing creature. But there are lots of other bees too, like native bees, solitary bees, bumblebees, all these other very cool bees. I don't know, more than 4,000 species in the U.S. And those bees don't have anybody tending to them or providing them special diets and moving them to better pastures and things like that. And so those bees and honeybees equally have a very, very hard time surviving in our modern landscape. And so it's still very, very tough time to be a bee. Whether you're a honeybee or a solitary bee, it's very, very difficult.
Yeah, and I know there's a lot of factors that sort of feed into that crisis for the bee population, everything from insecticides and environmental chemicals to loss of habitat and human development and changes in agriculture and so on. So how much do you think addressing this particular issue of nutrition scarcity could help the bees, and what difference might this new food source make for bee production?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think it's essential. It's really like the center point, I think, for helping bees. And whether that's, improving the landscape so there's natural forage, or like this approach, which I'm very excited about because it's sort of a simpler approach, or an approach that beekeepers can actually implement versus, trying to change modern farming practices or reduce urbanization. These are massive issues, right, that no individual beekeeper can impart change on. So in that way, it's, very applied and practical to be able to cause change. And I say it's really key because nutrition is essential, or it's a key aspect to addressing all the other complex issues affecting bees. So if you take pesticides, for example, it's well known that good nutrition, proper nutrition, healthy bees can overcome or resist pesticide pressures, right? So if you're starving and you get exposed to pesticides, you're probably dead meat. But if you have really good nutrition, you're very healthy, you might be impacted a bit by pesticides, but you can recover from that. And the same is true for these pests and pathogens. So it's well known that varroa mites and these viruses impact bees' health greatly. But it's been shown that if you have good nutrition, you're a very healthy colony, you can withstand greater viral pressures or withstand greater mite populations if you're healthy. So that nutrition is really central so that then they can survive these other pressures without a total colony loss.
Well, I know of one swarm that's going to be off the job for a little while. I wanted to ask you about this, even though it's a little bit off topic. On Friday, a semi-truck full of beehives bound for farms somewhere near the Canadian border turned over and released something like 250 million bees into the environment. And sheriff's deputies and others who arrived to try and help clean it up had to take cover to avoid being stung. What I'm wondering is what happens to those bees now? Are they going to be okay?
Yeah, unfortunately, they probably won't be okay, which is kind of sad. And so in some cases, they are able to fix that situation. If they get to it while it's still dark or cold and the boxes haven't been crushed or damaged too badly, sometimes they're able to stand that truck back up or get those colonies loaded onto a new truck and get them out of there. But oftentimes, especially on interstates or near cities, and if it's in the middle of the day, those bees immediately are flying up into the air, and they've got to get that under control for traffic and human safety reasons. And so oftentimes those colonies have to be sort of immediately taken care of in terms of
fumigated.
soapy water, and the colonies kind of have to be destroyed.
Oh, what a bummer.
To get the mess cleaned up. So it's kind of a sad deal, and it happens from time to time. And I don't know if we, connecting this back to what we're talking about is that, and what people often don't know is that part of moving colonies is a major requirement to meet the pollination demands in this country. So California requires more than 2 million colonies, which is 80 or 90% of every commercial colony in the country has to be trucked to California to pollinate almonds. And then those 2 million colonies have to be trucked out of California to the next crops across the U.S. And oftentimes they're trucked around like that 6 or 7 times throughout the season to pollinate the vast, number of different crops that they contribute to. Wow.
That's a reminder of this kind of silent workforce that is a crucial link in our food supply. Is there anything, Brandon, that we didn't mention that you think is important to include in this conversation?
Yeah, it had me thinking again with this turned over truck, the thing that having a complete diet like this for bees might also help take some additional burden off of the landscape. And what made me think of it was this truck turning over is that not only do we have to move bees around by the semi-load like this for pollination purposes, but we as beekeepers, have to move bees around in the landscape like that, also just to spread them out when they're not in pollination. So you can't take the 10,000 colonies you own when you're done with pollination, and now it's say like August, and just put them in the same parking lot or something, right? So now you got to take those 10,000 and spread them into hundreds of locations across the landscape.
In order for them to have enough forage to get the nutrition that they need.
Exactly. And so that's not only difficult, on the bees and the beekeeper, but there are, it's also a strain on the ecosystem. So all those solitary bees that live out there in these locations, then, in some ways, and this is a little bit controversial, but you can imagine that they might be competing in some circumstances for resources with those honeybees. And so if we were able to have a complete diet where we could maintain larger, greater densities of these honeybee colonies, not be forced to spread them out so widely across the landscape, because we had a truly complete nutritional diet, it would benefit the ecosystems, and it would benefit the beekeepers, and it would, be a great help, I think, for the whole system.
We don't need to go out. We have power bars at home.
That's right, yeah.
Brandon Hopkins is a professor of pollinator ecology at Washington State University, and he's co-author of a study on bee food published in the Proceedings of the Royal Society Bee last month. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It's been great talking with you.
And that story first aired in June. You're listening to Soundside. And before we go today, recently we sat down with Skamania County Sheriff Summer Shire to discuss if negligent hikers should be charged a fee for rescue services. We asked you for your opinion, and boy, did you have thoughts. We wanted to share some of your messages about emergency rescue fees.
Hi. I just wanted to put my word out that I think a fine would be a good idea for people that are irresponsible. I mean, you have to grow up sometime, right?
Hi, Libby. This is Beth Ann from Bainbridge Island. I agree with that. I think that's a really smart idea. It does seem that, if there's some ownership of the problem they've caused, that could also make people be more conscientious of the danger that they're undertaking.
Cody Small of Kitsap County area writes, I support her proposed fee structure through tickets because adults should be cautious while being out in nature. And if you're prepared, then you won't get a ticket.
Hi, my name is Paula. I live in Skagit County, and I wanted to chime in and say that I absolutely support this. I think this is extremely important. And unfortunately, there's also a very large overlap of people who are not prepared with people who just don't respect the wilderness. So I think that having some type of heightened awareness, whether that needs to be financial implications or not, will hopefully teach people to respect these areas that they're wanting to explore and make them learned that in order to explore them, they have to be prepared and, again, respect the area.
Hi, my name is Ruth Burks, and I think absolutely they should be fined. You know, I'm a lifelong resident of Washington State, and I feel people need to prepare and to educate themselves and to realize that you can't just dive in and do whatever you want just because you're out in the great outdoors without suffering the consequences. And I think people need to take responsibility for actions.
If the threat of a fine for irresponsible behavior in the backcountry keeps people home, that's a good thing. Just as it's good if the threat of a fine for speeding prevents someone who insists on speeding from driving. I have heard of other countries where people behaving recklessly or negligently have to pay for their rescue, and I'm not opposed to that. But a flat fine is a good first step. Kathy, lifelong hiker, backpacker, sometimes climber, and cross-country skier, Marysville. Thank you again to everyone who called in to share their stories. That's it for Soundside today. Today's show was produced by Shane Mailing and me, Sarah Leibovitz, with assistance from Hans Anderson, Jason Burrows, Maliha Syed, and Gabrielle Healy. Our editor is Jed Kim. Our hosts for this show were Libby Denkman and Gabriel Spitzer. Soundside will be back tomorrow. We'll see you then.